Good afternoon, everyone. We'll ask you to take your seats and we'll kick off this session called Into the Blue. Thanks, Rod. As we know, healthy water underpins our lifestyles and livelihoods. So how do we manage and build waterways resilience to support communities that rely on them? First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that to all First Nations people in the room today and your elders past, present and future. For those that don't know me, my name's Renee Woods. I'm a Nurri man from southwest New South Wales, so the lower Lachlan, lower Murrumbidgee areas. My background is freshwater. Wear a number of hats in the freshwater space, too many to juggle in some cases. I also work with the Nature Conservancy Australia as the Associate Director of Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities as of recent. We've got quite an interesting panel today. Very different projects, very much community driven. I'm going to hand to Chris Buchanan first to come up and start his presentation. Chris is from the Nature Glenelg Trust. It's a good start, eh? Yarra Valley Water. That's right, we are too. Chris is from Yarra Valley Water. How good am I going? It must be late on the Wednesday afternoon. So Chris is from Yarra Valley Water. Chris has worked in the water space for over 20 years and brings a passion, engineering excellence, care for the environment, and a first mindset to everything he does. Chris has worked with a wide range of roles, including Yarra Valley Waters, including waste treatment, recycled water, among many other things. So I'll hand to Chris now to talk about his project and the great work he's doing with Yarra Valley Water. Thanks.
Thanks, Renee. You might remember me from former sessions today. So I'm going to go a little bit quicker through my slides. There is a little bit of overlap around what I've already talked about, and I think my panellists would appreciate a little bit of extra time. Click. So very quickly, a little bit about Yarra Valley Water. So we're what we call a retailer in the water sector. So we buy water off the wholesaler. We retail it to our customer base, roughly 2 million people, a third of Melbourne, approximately. We take back the water a little bit dirtier, and we either treat it ourselves. We treat about 10% of the wastewater that we collect, and 90% of the water we actually hand back to Melbourne Water for tailworks processing and release to the environment, either out into the bay in Melbourne or down on the coastline at east or west side of Melbourne. So we're a statutory authority. A lot of people have been asking me, who are we? And who are we owned? So we're a single shareholder model owned by the state government. So we have an operating licence with the state government to provide those water and sewer retail services, and the Minister provides us a letter of expectations around all sorts of different things she expects us to do. We have service area around 4,000 square kilometres, and in terms of this conference, in terms of private land, we own about 1,600 hectares of land. Most of that land is located at sewage treatment facilities producing recycled water that's either sent back to, if we produce it to Class A standards, what we call in Victoria, we do send some back to housing estates. A lot of it is discharged into the environment, some of it in the Yarra River. Some of you might be interested to know some of that does occur upstream of some of the water offtake that goes into Melbourne's system. So there is a little bit of, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this too much out loud, but there's an indirect potable reuse going on in Melbourne at a small scale. So this is one of the photos of land that we have at one of our sites, and this is historically how we've thought of the land, buffering our wastewater treatment plants. As I said this morning, it's largely been growing grass, feeding cows, and thou shalt do nothing else with it. And we've never really, over the first probably 15 years of Yarra Valley Water's existence, didn't really appreciate the natural asset that we had. But we've been on a bit of a journey. There's been a really significant evolution of our environmental philosophy as a business over the last 20 years, 25 years. And it really started from a compliance mindset, follow the regulations, meet EPA guidelines, state environment protection policy guidelines, shifted into, we think we can do better. How do we minimise our impact? How do we protect the environment better? And really around that time was when we started saying, well, as an organisation, and a lot of organisations across the world, I think at the same time, were saying, what actually is our environmental footprint as a business? Obviously greenhouse gas implications, nutrients discharged into waterways. And it got us thinking more about who we are in the context of nature. It seems like a really sort of a strange thing to say, that we had to have an awakening as a business, that we are part of nature and we're in the water cycle. But we really did think of ourselves as a utility, owning pipes, running pipes, linear assets in the ground. Nobody ever sees them. And that was the focus of our mindset, even in the environmental space. But fast forward, to today, a couple of Indigenous board members on our board have really driven think about what does care for country mean for us as a business. Thinking about that environmental impact, we've gone from how do we minimise that impact to how do we actually pay it forward and get beyond zero carbon. What role do we have in circular economy, and how do we support healthy ecosystems, which is obviously the big linkage into this conference. And so that's resulting in a new strategy pillar that we have in our 2030 strategy for the business, which is called Honouring and Healing Country. And it's very early. That was only launched to the business in June this year at our annual launch event. And it's fair to say we're still grappling what that actually means. But in this landscape space, we've got some really good opportunities where we can see that already coming to life. And then we'll start to think about how do we translate that into working in the landscape when we're maintaining a pipe in the street. What's the cultural implications there? What's the environmental implications there? So that's a little bit about our journey. And as part of that journey, Bufferland, as I've said, has become less about airspace and air gap and keeping people away from our smelly wastewater assets. Wastewater treatment processes massively improved over the last 50 years and really aren't that bad. If you've been to a wastewater treatment plant, you're probably happily, pleasantly surprised at how good and pleasant it can be to be at some of these facilities. And so we're shifting this Bufferland thinking more into social, environmental, economic and cultural value generation potential. There's a picture there of circular utility services that we're delivering at one of the sites, which I'll talk about in a minute. We bought the land to produce recycled water to supply back to a housing estate. That provided us 167 hectares that we could explore different uses on. We've moved into organic waste processing. We're producing renewable energy. We're on a path to 100% renewable energy by 2025. We're exploring the role of green hydrogen at that facility, produced from recycled water and renewable energy. There's a byproduct of the hydrogen in that you produce oxygen. You can actually put that back into the wastewater process and make that process even more efficient. So there's a lot of circular synergy there. We've also got community enterprise happening on the site. We've got a community farm that's emerging, and that social enterprise is very interested in conservation activities. We actually have proactive conservation management requirements on the site, and the community farm community are actually helping us deliver those conservation services and outcomes in a more cost-effective manner. And so there's that circular model around the utility services, but obviously it's also an opportunity for endangered flora and fauna protection and regeneration. And we're also really proud that we're working more and more closely with traditional owners to provide opportunities for self-determined care for country outcomes. So we've actually got part of one of the sites allocated to traditional owners to do whatever they see fit on the site in terms of natural resource management, caring for the land and cultural practice, which is really exciting. I won't touch too much on this one. I've talked about it already today, but just wanted to quickly whiz through 3 case studies. So we've got our Upper Yarra habitat regeneration. As I spoke about this morning, this is really about lowland leadbeaters, possum and helmeted honeyeater habitat regeneration. The picture here is of the low-lying land on the banks of the Yarra River, which is a fantastic site to regenerate swampland habitat for the critters, the 2 species. And there's a nice synergy there is that if climate change does dry out this environment, we'll actually be able to provide water into that swampland habitat to make it more climate resilient over time. Massive partnership, huge number of players in the mix, and a fantastic project. A couple of different examples I just wanted to touch on. So we've got, this is our Wallen swamp regeneration site. It's probably a little bit more in the incubator phase compared to Upper Yarra, which is a very distinct plan. It's got a funding plan. It's got the partnerships in place. This is flood irrigation bays that surrounded our Wallen wastewater treatment plant that we no longer need because we've built sewage system up to this part of northern part of Melbourne. And we don't actually need to process all of the recycled water on site. It used to be irrigated for sheep grazing. At the moment, we've been very passive in letting the land regenerate itself. We are seeing flora and fauna regeneration just naturally without us doing anything. But in time, we see the potential for a more constructed asset that responds to the landscape and provides opportunity for Indigenous flora and fauna regeneration. We think there's also potential to do stormwater harvesting on the site, which would actually benefit the upper reaches of Merry Creek by taking flooding flows out of that ephemeral waterway at certain times. And we're also starting to work with our neighbours in this area. So that just on the fringe up the top there is some of the housing development that's happening next to this site. And we're actually been working with that developer to say, don't just build a bog standard wetlands that Melbourne Water would like you to build. Talk to us and talk to people like Mark around what could we do in terms of building an ephemeral wetland that actually responds to the landscape and is actually, regenerating the Indigenous landscape that was here before this colonial impact. And there's, like the other sites, there is opportunity for Indigenous land management. We're talking to Wurundjeri, we're talking to Narrap Rangers about potentially managing these wetland structures into the future when they're delivered. And the last case study, and I'll see if I can give back a minute, this is the Aurora site that I spoke to in pictures before. This is a photo of the recycled water facility with the organic waste processing facility next door. So that's predominantly food waste coming out of industry. That was previously headed for landfill. It's now being anaerobically digested here, producing methane and then being burnt to produce renewable energy. You can have a little bit of a debate about whether that's green energy, but it's greener energy, and it's biogenic cycling in the food cycle is how it's been accredited. So as I said, this site's recycled water production, organic waste processing, Indigenous land management, a community farm, and we've also got Melbourne Polytechnic, TAFE, coming along board, and they're actually doing conservation, education training and horticulture activities on the site as well. So it's just an amazing precinct of circular economy activities and natural regeneration. So we're really excited about all of this and we wanted to share that with you, and that's all I had to say. Thank you. It's not all I had to say. There's one more thing. There's a whole lot of other potential sites. The last stop point is that we are starting to explore our role in that site up there in the north called Hazelwyn. It is flagged for urban development, and we're thinking about how do we bring those principles into land that's going to be developed to grow houses? How do we be water positive, energy positive, and biodiversity positive? So that's really exciting. We'll see where that goes.
Thanks, Chris. Up next, I've got Cath Dickson, Dr. Catherine Dickson, Conservation Science and Planning Manager with the Tasmanian Land Conservancy. Cath's going to talk about salty solutions enhancing ecological resilience of salt marshes communities under climate change. Thanks, Cath.
Hi all, thank you for having me. I'm going to take you today on a whirlwind tour of two of our sites and looking at how we're looking to enhance the resilience of these salt marsh communities. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, as well as the Palawa people who are the traditional owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, where this work has been conducted. I'd like to acknowledge their continuing connection with both culture and with land across these sites. Right, as a very brief introduction I work with the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, or TLC. We work across Tasmania, and we have about a third of our estate of these 100,000 hectares is our own reserves. And then we also work a lot with private landholders across a number of other programs, whether that be Land for Wildlife or with the Midlands Conservation Partnership or Revolving Fund. Today I'm going to be focusing on that third, so two of our reserves. It'll be both our first reserve, which is Long Point, and actually our latest reserve, which is Sloping Main. And these two reserves are on the east coast of Tasmania. They have in common the nationally vulnerable temperate coastal saltmarsh. They're extensive areas of saltmarsh, and they're responding to climate change across those systems. And I'm going to have a go at this. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start off at Long Point Reserve. So Long Point is nestled into the mouth of the Molting Lagoon Ramsar site. It's up near Freycinet National Park on the east coast of South Australia. It's an amazing and extensive area of saltmarsh, some of the largest areas of saltmarsh in Tasmania. It has fantastic values. You've got areas of really old Tecticornia, or that shrubby glasswort, some of which has been dated around 300 years old, which just blows my mind. These things are so little, and then to have those kind of dates. So you can see areas like that out there now. The modelling that's been done by the University of Tasmania looking at sea level rise around Tasmania shows that most of our saltmarsh communities will be shallowly inundated by 2050 and certainly by 2100. So things are changing. However, for Long Point, we didn't think that there was much change evident yet, but we were keen to make sure that we were addressing all the threats that are happening out on that property to ensure that our conservation targets are in the best condition that they can be. And so we were lucky in 2020 to have funding from the Australian government to work with a number of partners to undertake threat abatement. And so we worked really closely with Nature Glenelg Trust, so Mark Bachmann, and looking at restoring the eco-hydrology across the site. We did a whole lot of weed control and also some revegetation. When Mark and I were out on site doing a bit of a familiarisation for Mark, it was one of those amazing days where you get that chance to wander around just a really specky salt marsh. And then we started coming down the side and we started noticing all these stumps of Garnia and also our big Ostrostipers out in the salt marsh. And it just started to trigger that question of, first of all, we hadn't really noticed. We hadn't seen that big change, so how long has this been happening for? And that's really when the value of our long-term ecological monitoring really kicks in, and it really shows itself to be so important. So TLC has a number of levels of monitoring. We have surveillance monitoring across all of our reserve network, which looks at vegetation, condition against statewide benchmarks. And so we had this set up for Long Point as well. So what you can see in these photos of in the centre of the reserve is that basically the Garnia and the Ostrostipes are a bit gone in different sections, and that was just from 2014 through to 2019. That triggered us to delve deeper again, and we were lucky enough that in 2014 Dr. John Elders had set up 3 long transects across the reserve, which gave us a great baseline to go back in. And what we could see in these transects was the cover of the vegetation. So these are these same 3 transects and their elevational profiles. And what you can see with the colours is the blue is the salt marsh in the lowest area, the green is the saline rushland and a slightly higher, and the brown is your terrestrial veg. And when I analysed the data, sure enough, it showed us what we were seeing on the ground. So there were statistically much higher levels of bare ground, so that's indicated in the red. In some cases it was up to 75% increase. We were seeing in the central transect that a complete loss of Garnia trifida, and also our big Ostrostipes declined by 25%. And then in the southern transect we were getting that significant decline in salt marsh. So what can we do? And in these, we know or we think that it is related to those rising in sea levels, albeit marginal, and probably increase in salinity on the land. But it's not something that we can directly affect right there and then. So I like to think about it, and in this particular model, which is one of the papers that we put out just recently, to think about it as having an awareness of what the values are and anticipating those changes that you might see, but then most importantly, moving into action. What can you do? Can you recover, restore, renovate, or adapt your area? So for what did we do for Long Point? So working with Mark, we moved into the restore phase, and it was looking at removing some of these drains which were put in the convict era, and then some drain networks that were part of an aquaculture project in the 90s. So that meant looking at using the levee banks and filling it back into the original height of or elevation of the soil there. So in practice, what that looked like was Mark and the excavator drivers actually being really careful to find that biological layer, which is the black in the image, and then zipping these drains shut. We also went through and we helped with a bit of revegetation, but as you would know, saltmarsh and other wetland vegetation areas are very quick to restore. So although in this case we're not taking away that threat of a rising sea level, we are actually giving the best chance for those vegetation communities to move unimpeded up those profiles along the wetland. I now want to zip over to Sloping Main because this place has just captured, I was going to say our attention, but it might be my attention. And it has Burden's Marsh, which is what you can see right there. It's a really extensive salt marsh that is tucked in behind a consolidated sand dune. It has the quite rare characteristic in Tasmania of having really gentle slopes, which means that vegetation can move if it need be. And then quite a narrow mouth going out to the sea. It has extensive areas of salt marsh. It too also has expected to be shallowly inundated by 2050. So for us, the first challenge was really about storytelling with our board. How do you convince a board that they want to purchase something that will be shallowly inundated in 50 years' time or 40 years' time? So this is about talking with the public about change and how we expect things to look like in the future, and the fact that there will still be really important values even if it was inundated into the future, whether that be for shorebirds or waterfowl or other aquatic species. So similarly, we're using that same approach of looking at creating that awareness, so understanding with monitoring about what are the values that we have, and then looking at that anticipation. And again, we're working with Nature Glenelg Trust to anticipate and think about 3 different scenarios. Do we just let it do its thing when we just restore the drains, so have quite a passive approach? Do we think about maybe we'd put a spillway in and have it at a set height? Or do we look at quite an intensive intervention and think about putting a weir and operate the height or choose the height of the wetland? The next step will be action, but it's also really important to have that community buy-in. So this is where we will be working with local communities and also the local communities in the area. And so I guess what I wanted to end on was that as ecologists or land managers, we're starting to see things really change in our environment, and there is this chance to think about how we're doing things, and that important acknowledgement that doing nothing is also an active choice as well. So I guess I wanted to convince you that there's a pathway to going forward, but actively choosing to do what you're going to do, if that is actively intervene or nothing, but make it a choice as opposed to an indecision paralysis. I've got -7, sorry. We're going to skip over that. Ooh, and we're going backwards, sorry. Thank you.
Thanks, Cath. So up next we've got Mark Bachmann, from the Managing Director of and founder of Nature Glenelg Trust. He's going to talk about wetland restoration across Australia and the work that they're doing over the years. Thanks, mate. Cheers.
Excellent. Thank you, and hello everybody. Great to see you. I just thought to start off I would, just quick introduction to Nature Glenelg Trust. We're a not-for-profit charitable organisation that works across southeastern Australia. We have about 35 staff based across the 4 southeastern states, and we've got a particular focus on ecological restoration and really community-led, ground-up type projects. And the thought today was that we'll focus in on some of our wetland restoration projects and give you a sense of the different contexts in which this sort of work is occurring around the parts of the country that we're working in. So, given the time constraints of today, we're going on a very quick journey across even more sites than Cath tried to show you. So, we're going to start in South Australia, in Yarra country, just south of Adelaide on the Fleurieu Peninsula, and can't talk about restoring wetlands without talking about peatlands, our most carbon-rich wetlands, and we do have peatlands in Australia. One of the things you'll see characterised by peatlands, and this site called Glen Shearer Swamp straddles, as you can see there, both public and private land. Pre-reservation peatlands across their extent in lowland areas of Australia are characterised by these really dense drainage networks. You need to intensively drain peat to get the water out of it because it's a very effective sponge at holding water, and you usually have shallow groundwater involved. Similar diagram to one you saw in the previous talk, but in this case in a peatland context, the objective with peatland restoration really needs to be or should be reinstating the natural surface and allowing that recovery of groundwater level to drive a process of resaturation, and also just to change the behaviour of water and flows through these environments, so that you end up with, rather than channelized flows below natural surface and with a dehydrated substrate above, water finding its way diffuse and slowly back through the surface and resaturating that profile. And that process, what it looks like, this is an example of the most recent phase of works that we've undertaken out at Glen Shearer Swamp, and these drains actually run up a slope. It's the process of backfilling that was going on last year. And to give you an idea of the sort of spontaneous recovery that occurs, this is that same area just 12 months later, showing the effect of resaturating the peat profile and the vegetation response. Rightio, so let's go to Northern New South Wales, Bundjalung country and the Aboriginal-owned Minyamai Indigenous Protected Area. And this is a floodplain example in a high rainfall area. Prior to this area being taken back on as Aboriginal land, it had a phase of as grazing country. During that time, there was a period where some of the floodplains were cleared and artificially drained, and you can see the footprint there from about 50 years ago. Unfortunately, in these high rainfall areas with dispersive subsoils, drains don't necessarily stay where or the dimensions that you put them in when they were constructed, and in some places these drains have eroded to 4 or 5 metres deep and 8 to 10 metres wide, and that sediment is ending up in the national park downstream next door. So there are waterways, artificial as they are now, in places where you used to previously have diffuse flows, moving across a floodplain as opposed to being channelized in that way. So our objectives here are to get water out of that drain. We haven't done the works here yet, but they're in train, assuming we can navigate all of our approval processes in that lovely bureaucratic state, New South Wales. Reduce erosion, and then look to redistribute those flows and slow the water down and rehydrate areas of habitat like that across this area of floodplain. So next up, let's head south down into Victoria, Jabberun country, and this is a wetland called Green Swamp, beautiful wetland that is partly now owned by our organisation and also straddles a Parks Victoria Reserve, which has been left high and dry by artificial drainage. The effect of that drainage you can see from these aerial photographs. We're fortunate here we have a pre-drainage image from the 40s. You can see the effect of artificial drainage there, with only a portion of the wetland inundating in that image from 2012. And as a result of reversing artificial drainage, restoring this to its full supply level, we now have a wetland that looks much more like it looked historically, which is fantastic. And not only is this having an ecological benefit, but in this case, this site is also protecting downstream neighbours who are tetchy about the fact that this wetland had been drained more recently and was causing downstream flooding impacts. So really great to get along with downstream neighbours by actually reversing some of those changes which had been negative to people downstream. And in terms of ecological impacts, this site is now it's nearby to what's known as the Willora flocking area for Brolga in the Brolga population that occurs in southern Australia that straddles the South Australian Victorian border. And they decided after restoration in 2016 that they would keep turning up to this wetland in increasing numbers to the extent that we now have about 250 birds are regularly gathering each year. This is a newly recreated flocking site for Brolga, which is very exciting. Rightio, so another site in Victoria in Yorta country, this wetland's called Rowan Swamp. This is an example of an in-stream wetland. It's Parks Victoria Reserve, where you can see from this image that the early survey diagram from the 1880s compared to modern LiDAR imagery shows the migration of the creek line at this wetland, where you've got an in-stream wetland that's had its sill level breached by the natural creek, which is the natural waterway, but eroding and cutting its way back into the wetland edge, which has reduced the sill level of the wetland. And we know that the soil level has moved because when you go out on site, you even find places where the beautiful big old red gums, which predate these changes, now have roots exposed above natural surface, which allows us to calibrate and triangulate these different information sources to piece together the history of the site and its history of change. So we take information like that, work out where the original wetland edge was, work out where you would build a trial structure to reinstate natural water levels, and you can predict the inundation impact using LiDAR, as we've done there. Get out there with a team of partners and volunteers and a day's work, and we put the trial structure in place, which got a workout straight away with a rainfall event last year, and the sort of effects in this wetland have been fantastic. Now an example from, I guess, the pointy end of wetland issues in urban growth zones, and this wetland in Wurundjeri country is actually just upstream of the wetland area that Chris was showing you earlier at Wallen. This is a wetland called Burrumbullock in the Wallen area, and that wetland feature you can see there in the bottom left was mapped as early as, well, even earlier than this actually, but this map's from the 1860s. It's an interesting site. It straddles public and private land. The southern part is actually part of that Yarra Valley Water Reserve, where there's an interest in potential restoration of this wetland as part of the future urban structure. But you have the dilemmas here with the planning and various issues and politics involved with part of the wetland being privately owned and where there are other objectives potentially around urban development. So the area still inundates after heavy rainfall, as you can see there, and we can see what the restoration potential of this area is. And depending on which way it falls with the planning system in this area, fantastic potential to potentially integrate much smarter water management into the design of a future urban environment. This is where we need to be going in this country, given that we've built on a lot of our floodplains in urban environments. Hopefully we can get there in this example, but it remains to be seen. And yeah, just a quick one down in where Cath was talking about down in the country in Tassie, which I'll talk really quickly about because she's already explained this site, but at Long Point and other adjacent private areas adjacent to Moulting Lagoon, the intention here was to remove levees and drains to reverse the impact of drainage and changes to topography on the hydrology of saltmarsh. And Cath mentioned about the speed of recovery. This image is taken 12 months after showing the speed of saltmarsh recovery in these environments in the works footprint. That's a zone where a drain and levee bank was previously present. So just to wrap up, a few key themes that I thought would be worth mentioning in closing. Make no mistake, this continent really from north to south, east to west, and let's not forget those big islands that we have off the mainland as well. Everywhere you go, if you know what to look for, and when you read the landscape, you will see impacts on our wetlands, waterways, floodplains, and this includes our protected areas. So let's not just assume because an area has a covenant or is in a reserve that it's all sweet, because prior land management means we're carrying the legacy of these impacts on our waterways and wetlands. But the thing that I'm hoping you'll go away from this session feeling is optimistic about the fact that if we manage water if we're clever with how we manage water, hydrology is an incredibly powerful restoration tool. And it's powerful because it's got that sort of superpower that there's a whole lot of things that happen automatically when you get the water regime right, and it's harder in terrestrial ecosystems. Community have had a real role in all of these projects. I can't go into the depth of that involvement, but rest assured that it's a really important part of the story and history of all of these projects, and we love involving people in the work. Wetlands really do deliver fantastic outcomes for carbon, water and biodiversity, even though at the moment we don't appropriately account for the carbon and water benefits, which is a concern. And there are biases in our methods at the moment that mean that we overlook some of these opportunities. And yeah, look, threatened species turn up in terms of biodiversity response. As soon as you restore wetlands, that Australasian bitten there and that wetland project bottom left, that just happened this past autumn, winter. Within 3 weeks of re-inundating that wetland, Australasian bitten turned up again in this wetland, which is amazing, and just one example of what happens when you restore wetlands. The context of examples you've seen today are relevant across this country, both rural and urban. And the final point is just to make a mention that another thing I'd love you to go away from today thinking about is our need to have a more sophisticated conversation about water in this country. We've got parts of the country where it's just interesting, the extremes. There are parts of the country where water is because of the giving away of water that happens when we facilitate development or opening up of new industries in areas. There's then the inevitable pulling back that needs to happen as we try and work out what the sustainable limits are. For those of you from Tasmania or the Northern Territory, I mean, there are large amounts of water now being effectively given away for nothing. And it'd be great not to remake those mistakes in new areas if we can avoid it. So on that happy note, I've gone over time, so I'll say thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks, Mark. To the start. Up next, we've got Rod Marsh, Director of Strategy and Programs at Watertrust Australia. Rod's going to talk about his work, he's understanding equity and fairness and justice across water management across Australia and its catchments. It's had a bit of a fit. Sorry, Rod.
That's okay.
Jump back to the start. Yeah, quick.
Right.
Just while we're jumping back, the app is there, and hopefully some questions will be coming through from the audience. We will have a couple other questions from the panel. Wow.
One solution would be to just turn it off because I don't have slides.
Well, that's probably why I jumped back. Okay, yeah. I'll hand to Rod.
So,
Just close it.
if we close that. Maybe. We can live with that one. So we can stay with these images because I don't have any slides for you. I want you to listen to a few things today. First thing I thought I might do, because I am a real outlier, I think, in this panel today, is talk very, very briefly about Watertrust Australia, where I'm from, in case people don't know where we're coming from. So Watertrust is a relatively new NGO, created and funded by a coalition of 16 philanthropies for a decade, with a really simple mission, which is to facilitate water and catchment policy and management decisions that are seen as fairer, more reasonable, more evidence-informed and more legitimate. So our work aims to show how this can be done and then to help make it happen. A key part of this is that Watertrust was funded to be entirely independent and have no interest in any particular outcome, but have a real focus on the way decisions are made. We're working across Australia, and we're currently working on initiatives that take us from Cape York to the Derwent, from Darwin to the Northern Basin. Alongside these initiatives, we've got a piece of work which I'll talk about today around equity, fairness and justice in water policy making. And the reason I haven't got any slides is I'd like you to listen to some water stories about politics And I think about politics as who gets what, when and how, who gets to decide, and who gets to frame the space in which those decisions are made. So these are stories about how what's fair matters. And true to Watertrust's mission, I won't be telling you what fairness is, but I want you to join me in listening to some of the voices with a real stake in water policy, in this case in the basin, although the project is Australia-wide. And to pull this out, I'd like to acknowledge the work of some of our partners at UQ, who've worked with us in the computational humanities space, which has allowed us to get on top of a couple of thousand submissions made to 8 inquiries over the last decade. We're actually going to expand that out to probably looking at more than 5,000 submissions, and we've begun an analysis of social media and a whole lot of other media pieces to look at these stories. I'm a dairy farmer from northern Victoria, and I feel that as a family and community we're being persecuted and exploited as a voiceless minority. These changes have moved profit and power into the hands of the wealthy. Water has moved out of our region so much that our regional economy, community and environment are being destroyed. It's not equitable, and it supports the interests of outside parties over traditional farmers. First Nations people since colonisation have been fighting for land and water justice. It's abhorrent that others are able to access these resources for free and without licences or rights, and they will inevitably be gifted a large asset through this licensing process. This process is shameless in its racism. Water sharing arrangements need overhauling to provide more equitable sharing between the environment and consumptive use. We need not to just keep a river functioning, but maintain the health of wetlands, riparian communities and aquatic fauna. Basin communities have seen the consequences of water policy processes that have not been equitable. Trust is deficient among many communities. The Water Act and subsequent development of the plan has entrenched perceptions of inequity that will be difficult or impossible to change. Water is the lifeblood out here, and to take it away just so someone with a buttload of money can make a buttload more is ridiculous, hurtful, short-sighted and unfair. It's totally unfair for big business to be allowed to cause so much damage to the ecosystems that belong to Australians living today and in the future. It's extraordinary the extent to which the Southern Basin is called upon to bear the unfair burden of delivering water to South Australia when for some time the Northern Basin has contributed little or any water. The historic over-allocation of water property rights, the capping and reduction of water entitlements over time has never been accompanied by measures to address the initial inequity of access experienced by First Nations communities. The introduction of a water market has compounded this ongoing inequity by monetising the value of these limited entitlements and increasing the advantage of those with existing property rights. The Basin Plan, in my opinion, comes complete with a thick protective layer of lies, dishonesty that is designed to con the public and appear to give the plan and its process credibility. Water injustice runs deep in Australia. Fixing it means handing control to First Nations. As we've looked at the over 2,000 submissions we've looked at so far, and picking up on computational techniques that you'll experience day to day, and if you use a translation app or other text analytic processes, what we see is a deep and palpable sense of anger and injustice. People have really strong ideas about what is equitable, fair or just. But what's fair? Because you'll see as I've talked there are at least 4 major narratives flowing through that. We've got an environmental narrative where the environment doesn't get a fair share because of agricultural special interests, consumptive water use practices and compromised science. We've got a First Nations narrative that tells of deep injustice in settlement, entrenched historic exclusion inherited from the colonial era and further exacerbated by policy since then. We've got an interstate politics narrative that we've had for more than 100 years, where the problem is state parochialism and unfair allocation between upstream and downstream users. And we've got a rural agricultural narrative where water reforms are unfair because they've forced family farms to compete with big corporates, where there have been massive failures of consultation and communication, and where agricultural sector vulnerabilities have been exploited and inequitable burdens placed on small communities. But among the differences, as we look more deeply, what we see is actually there's a common theme, And in fact, there's a common moral sentiment or sense of moral sentiment that they all share. And we know that even young children, in fact, when they're pre-verbal, express moral sentiments. They're very sensitive to equitable distributions of rewards. And so under the controversy, what we see is a deeper background of shared values that we think is possible to build into. And so an understanding of what might make policy understood as inequitable and unfair allows passionate debate about and potentially the productive management of water. But that's not the way water policy reform's been done. So the water policy reforms of the last 30 years have prioritised efficiency gains from microeconomic reforms and some return of water to the environment. They've sought an optimal policy, a word that appears in the Water Act. From another worldview, perhaps we could call it the Treasury perspective. And we'd contend, both from our analysis of text, but also analysis of the challenges that the Basin Plan and other water reforms have faced, that in fact the failure to address community and stakeholder concerns about equity and fairness has contributed to the challenging politics of reform and the slow and uneven implementation of the plan. Narratives of justice and unfairness have helped build advocacy coalitions, and they've been strategically deployed by multiple constituencies, often leading to policy deadlock. Trust is critical to responding effectively to water policy conflicts and challenges, but trust can't exist where stakeholders and communities believe the processes of water policy development and policy outcomes are unfair, inequitable or unjust, and that those outcomes are not up for debate. In many ways, there's no satisfactory resolution of the complex problems inherent in water management, whether in the basin, the Colorado, other major rivers worldwide, without dealing with issues of equity. But those issues of equity can't be drilled top-down. There's not a technocratic response. They've got to come bottom-up by that learning and understanding of finding that common sentiment that we're seeing across these submissions, across Twitter, across tweets, in YouTube files and elsewhere. So our suggestion is that policymakers will struggle to make workable and implementable policy unless policy analysis and development explicitly incorporates a dialogue between parties committed to very different and often incommensurable views of the world. Because what we saw across those four worldviews I described to you we see as the same definition of fairness, but being expressed through a totally different construction of what's happening and a totally different construction of what the politics of water are. And we think under that there is potential for debate, dialogue and what we'd call constructive conflict, because of that common moral sentiment we're seeing across all parties, this offers the potential to find the common ground needed for a workable agreement. And as Walter Lippmann commented more than 100 years ago, the goal of politics is not to get everyone to think the same, it's to get them to people who think differently to act alike. And our aim is to learn and demonstrate how this can be done. So as a final note as I finish up, you might ask, what does the law say about equity, fairness and justice? And we've worked with researchers at the University of Melbourne to examine a wide range of legislation. And what we see is actually a really regular appearance of the terms equity and fairness and justice. But because I'm coming up to time, that might have to be a question that we explore at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod, and thank you, panel, for the amazing work you're doing and the presentations you've showed us this afternoon. I have got one question come through, and I'll throw it to anyone that wants to respond to it. What monitoring is being done to show the change over time in water quality, water levels, fauna and flora surveys? And then what is the process of heightening policy and funding awareness of this work you're seeing in the space? Mark?
How's that?
Yep.
Yeah, look, the monitoring for some of the examples that we've provided, look, to be honest, it varies wildly. The difficulty with aligning the timing of funding and its scope with what ideally we would do when it comes to the type of monitoring that you would have running parallel with this. And so the answer is we do as much as we can whenever and wherever we can. And then there are some sites where if the funding source is particularly short term and the action is clear cut and clearly no regrets, where you just get on with it and you have the assumption of benefit as a result of the portfolio of, we've now restored over 60 or 70 wetlands around Australia. You don't have to monitor every one of them to know that you're getting a positive impact, particularly the more you've done in the different types of wetlands. So it varies considerably. As a minimum, we certainly try and set up if you think about what are really useful overarching surrogate measures for wetland response, water level absolutely is a really useful one because you can tie it to elevation information, you can tie it to subsequent vegetation surveys. Water level, and we can deploy water level data loggers, and they're just collecting data all the time and you don't have to be there every day. So they're a great example of a really efficient, cost-efficient monitoring method. The biological methods are much more labour intensive, and therefore it's dependent on the site and who the partners are and where, and what the funding sources allow for. There was another part to that question, wasn't there? How we're influencing policy, coming to conferences like this, trying to get people. I mean, one of the dilemmas we have as a on-ground focused not-for-profit organisation without a dedicated arm of the organisation working in advocacy or with a person based in Canberra is we know that this works and it's really logical, but there's so little dedicated policy support for facilitating a lot of what we've been able to show you today. Like, we've got to try and... So the carbon space, we have the perverse situation in this country that there's no method for protecting, restoring, resaturating peatlands. Now, can you believe that? Peatlands contain more carbon globally than our forests. Way better bang for buck in peatlands, and yet there's no method that encourages someone to take those areas and resaturate them. So who pushes that? I don't know how to be any more frank than to say those with the resources, the means, the time and the vested interest to do so. So if you're an organisation whose business model relies on having a method and you invest in it, you can get it up. But if you're an on-ground focused organisation, you don't have those resources. Yep. So it's a dilemma. Yep.
Definitely. No worries. The next question goes to Rod. Can you give us an example of where and how Watertrust works with communities in addressing inequity across water issues?
So I can answer maybe I'll take that question in two parts. Yep. So most of the time when we're working with people, it is not necessarily on equity issues. We've picked up this equity project primarily because of that shift to understanding that equity is held in really, really different ways, and we see it as a driver of conflict that leads to policy deadlock. Policy deadlock means that we end up getting poor outcomes or vastly delayed outcomes. So our issue is, rather than resolving an equity issue, our interest is in ensuring that a conflict driven by a sense of unfairness doesn't delay the development of high quality policy. Spaces where we've worked with communities in this space, or maybe a good example here would be work we've done, First Nations work we've done, which is very much supporting an interim working group of First Nations leaders to engage with government at ministerial level, with Minister Plibersek, to begin to understand how you might get a representation that sits beyond current structures that government's created, like Cowie, on which Renee sits, that's complementary to that, but that begins to find a way to ensure that First Nations voice is influential in a consequential way in the broader national water reform and policy process.
Thanks, Rod. The next question, I'll go to Cath and Chris. How do you share your success of the work you do to the wider community and facilitate participation in the community of the work you do?
It's I guess it's a multi-layered approach, and it depends on the location and where we're working and how long we've been in the community. If you think about Sloping Main for us and Burden's Marsh, it's a really new site. We've only had it for about a year, so we're still at this very start of creating those connections. And so for us at Tasmanian Land Conservancy, that means having a neighbours day where people can come in and just chat to us, because there's all sorts of ideas about what people think we're doing, which is not really what we're doing. But we're also really keen for them to understand what our goals are for the property. So when we work with Mark, for example, and this, we're asking Mark and NGT to do the restoration planning for us and to model these different types of management or restoration options. And then we want to work through with our stakeholders, both in the local community and also more widely within government, because everyone does have an opinion about how this wetland should be managed. You know, the previous landholder, it is what it is because of how he managed it. So it's this amazing salt marsh. It's also covered in drains. He also excavated it regularly, much to the dismay of parks. But it's about bringing them along in this journey. And I think from a TLC perspective, there's also a number of different ways that people are involved actively in what we're doing, whether that's out volunteering with our science team or operations team. Maybe it's about a discovery day when they come out on site. And then there are all the comms that come along with it as well. One of the area that we need to focus in on, particularly for this reserve, is working with the local Aboriginal people. It's not particularly straightforward or clear. And that will be a long process, and making those connections and just taking time to really get to know the community, and for the community to get to know us and work through that in this particular reserve, because it's clearly a really important site.
I can just add quickly to that too, that at projects we're working on with the Tasmanian Land Conservancy and other sites, that idea of bringing people, sharing information as we uncover it about an area, bringing people on the journey with us, having a really open approach to communication, that encourages community involvement and participation in the process. It actually allows for people to volunteer more information. They feel welcome to do so. We didn't have time to go into it, but these wetland restoration projects, before we actually do the action, there's a phase of quite intensive, I'm really big on historical research and the importance of actually understanding before we start making changes how we've landed where we are. And it's for anyone who works in environmental, any form of environmental restoration, really, that's your invitation point for connecting with people, is talking about the history. Like, I can't emphasise that enough. It's so much easier to get people the appetite for action and involvement if you've brought people with you in that discussion and valued what they have to contribute. So, it's got to be two-way, really, and make that opportunity available. Did you want to add anything, Chris, from Yarra Valley Water's perspective?
In simple terms, a lot of traditional pathways. We're a little bit premature on a lot of our projects to really be singing the song just yet. It's really a sector and industry kind of conversation at this point in time. We also have a complication in that we would like to actually create community connectivity to some of these places, but that's actually not what the conservation experts would like. Some of these endangered species actually don't want to tell the public where they are, and they don't want to create too much connectivity to them, feral species, all these kinds of things. So it's a little bit complicated in that space, but I think particularly the Aurora site, where there's a lot of things happening, that one we are very open and active with. We talk to a lot of MPs, get out on the beat and share the stories. Obviously, you can imagine it's hugely popular with the politicians. It sort of ticks every box possible. But yeah, a lot of social media work, traditional pathways, media releases in time. And also respecting what is our story to tell and what is not our story to tell. So a lot of the land management activities around First Nations activities on Aurora, we don't tell that story necessarily because it's not our story. So it's been culturally respectful in that way as well.
Yeah. Thanks. Are there any questions from the floor? I've got one more here coming through the app. I'll go to the app. Rod, this one's to you. In your 4 worldwide views, there appeared to be another similarity in they all saw big corporate ag as an unfair favour or privileged user group? Is this a common enemy or a useful unifier? Glad you're answering that.
Are we still unified? I don't. I think a key part of it, you do see corporate ag there, but then again, if I'd included submissions from corporate ag, you'd see another perspective. And so I think actually, again, from a Watertrust perspective, it's ensuring that all of these people are at the table. There are changes happening to the practices of Australian agriculture that aren't driven by Australian policy and certainly aren't driven by Australian water policy. They're driven by much, much bigger shifts, demographic shifts, broader shifts in international markets. So the work we do and the interest there is building that mutual understanding across all of these groups that actually there is this common piece where we're seeing a common understanding of what fairness might mean, but it is very much that construction of a worldview that shapes the conflict. And so our objective is to begin to set a table at which that dialogue and obviously what will be robust debate and what we're calling constructive conflict can occur to improve the quality of policy analysis from the asking of the question to the final policy piece, and to avoid the kind of end runs that tend to be done around two ministers close to election time.
Thank you. This last point there on the slide we've left up must have been coincidence, but the sophisticated conversation of water management in Australia going forward. We know there's going to be water scarcity, the climate change, everything else that's on the horizon. How can we have those sophisticated conversations as communities, all stakeholders? How do you think we could manage that together? Your thoughts and views on that as we move forward? To the whole panel.
I'll put one. I think there are a whole series of answers to that. One of the questions I'd add, though, is that a conversation about water is never a conversation just about water. Yep. And I actually think the key way to have a sophisticated conversation about water is to recognise all of the things that it touches, all of the parts of different lives, economies, occupations. Talking about water is talking about urban planning, it's talking about regional development, it's talking about climate change adaptation, it's talking about ecological restoration, it's talking about agricultural change. And in many of the spaces in which we are having these conversations about water, I think it's critical to recognise we're often having it, particularly in the areas where water's been used for a long time, in highly modified landscapes. And so there are a series of trade-offs that have to be made in that space. And the only way to have those trade-offs is to link water to the broader impacts changing its management will have.
Yeah, I don't think I've got any magical answers. It's complex. I think my observation across my career in water has been probably a reflection on how do you have the conversation about water when you're not in a mismanaged or crisis type of situation. Often there's very rapid conversations, rapid decision making, responding to crisis. There's been a lot of work in Victoria trying to make water while it's raining, if you know what I mean, as opposed to when we're in drought, we've got to do a desal, etc. We're trying to have a forward plan. We do have some 50-year strategies that we've been working on in the metro sector that is making sure we're having the dialogue with the community while we do have water in the storages, desals not at capacity, etc. And so that there is a forward plan. So that's useful. But I think, what's on the horizon, we're having a lot of conversations internally, batten down the hatches, it's all going to dry up again over the next however many years, and there will be some intensive conversations coming. So I think trying to have the conversation in more of an ongoing sense is one of the things. But we do see community waxes and wanes. It's not necessarily their number one priority. We have a lot of people talk in the sector about, we've got to have everyone more water literate, and I think it's a very nice ideologue, but it's not necessarily what people want to engage in. So I think some of the work that we're doing here and talking about that in a proactive sense and linking that in to that broader environmental climate change, we're also looking at the water supply into the future, not just this stuff. Having that dialogue as ongoing as possible is important. But yeah, I don't think there's any magical answer.
I might just say one thing before I do, that if you look at the history of water management in Australia, there's a 1988 Drought Policy Review Task Force report that talks about the hydro-illogical cycle in Australian policy making. So drought, knee-jerk panicked response, rain, complacency. which I think sums up kind of 35 years later exactly what you're saying.
Before Mark comes in and finishes up, I think there's the conversation around water is really, to me, closely linked to the ecological change conversation, and it's about having those transparent, ongoing conversations with the community, with our stakeholders about what things are changing and how things might change and what we're doing and what is possible, and keeping those conversations alive and ongoing. And I think, for me, TLC gives me, I suppose, hope of things that are still doing well in certain areas, and it's about also showing some of those areas that are doing well and that things might change, and how those values might change and how they might look in the future, but maintaining those conversations and keeping them I guess accurate as a scientist, but accurate and ongoing, but involved from all levels of the community, from people who are out wandering around the reserves with you to puddling around the wetlands, which is my favourite thing to do, and playing with the plants, but right up into policy as well, where we're having these open, transparent conversations that things are changing, and we need to keep thinking about what we're doing and how we might do it differently.
Yeah, I guess something I didn't mention that I think is relevant to this part of the discussion is that all the examples I showed you in my talk, these are places where the water didn't have to be purchased. So we do face this interesting, very stark set of circumstances. If you're interested in a wetland restoration project in your part of the world, the first question is, am I in a regulated or an unregulated catchment? If you're in an unregulated catchment or in a place where there are artificial drains trying to get rid of water, then you've leapfrogged ahead hugely just by being in a place where you don't have to purchase water first. And we do have the dilemma that in the places that are unregulated, there's also the risk that the increased pressure on that water resource might be coming. So I think getting in and restoring or correcting hydrology where and when we can now, because we can see the scarcity issues coming and the over-allocation issues coming in some places, you want to get onto it, because the places where water's regulated are not the places where we're doing these projects, because you've got to add an extra massive complicating factor to doing this sort of work when you've got to actually purchase the water in a regulated catchment.
Yep. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, panel, for this afternoon's session. Very informative, lots of conversation, plenty of work to do going forward. Can I ask everyone to thank Chris, Rod, Cath and Mark? Thank you. And it's afternoon tea time.